I carry this one moment with me, a moment I've never spoken about out loud. It was an early morning in a city that never slows down, yet somehow it felt like the world had paused just long enough for me to hear myself breathe. I was standing by a hotel window, watching the first thin line of sunlight stretch across the roofs. The cars were silent, the sidewalks empty, and there was this strange stillness that made the whole city look like it was holding a secret. For the first time in a long while, I wondered what it would be like to live a life where peace wasn't an accident, but a rhythm. That question followed me longer than I expected, like an echo or a quiet tug at the back of my mind. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I kept finding myself drawn to people who carried a kind of grounded confidence I couldn't quite name. People who weren't rushing even when life demanded speed. People whose struggles didn't make them bitter. People who didn't need noise to feel alive. I kept thinking, what do they have that I'm missing? And why does it feel like there's a whole world of peace that I can see but not touch? It was during that season of quiet questions that I stumbled across something remarkable. I was listening to stories, faith stories, discipline stories, human stories, and I kept hearing the same phrase, repeated with a reverence that felt ancient, praying 5 times a day. Muslims call it Salah, and the way they described it, it wasn't mechanical, it wasn't ritualistic in the shallow sense. It was purposeful, structured, deliberate. 5 moments carved out of the noise of life, not to escape, but to realign. I'd grown up hearing about prayer, but never prayer woven so intricately into the fabric of a day. Prayer that wasn't an emergency response to fear, but a lifestyle built on devotion and discipline. The more I listened, the more I realized I'd misunderstood something fundamental. I always assumed spirituality was this spontaneous thing you tapped into whenever you felt lost or grateful. But this was different. This was a pattern, a shape, a daily architecture for the soul. And the part that shook me was hearing people describe how it changes everything, not by grand miracles or dramatic signs, but by anchoring a person to something unshakable 5 times a day. I remember thinking, how does anyone keep up with that level of consistency? But the answer came softly, almost humbly, because you're not just keeping up with prayer. Prayer keeps up with you. The more I explored it, the more layers opened up. Muslims rise before dawn for the first prayer. Before the world even begins its noise, they wash, they stand, they center themselves. There's something almost cinematic about that, stepping into the day not with chaos, but with clarity. Then midday, when the world is busiest, when stress peaks and patience wears thin, another prayer calls them back. A reminder in the heat of life that the soul wasn't meant to be crushed by pressure. Then afternoon, an evening prayer, a final closing prayer at night, a rhythm, a circle, a returning. That realization knocked something loose in me. I could feel my own life flash in contrast. My days were built on emails, deadlines, noise, and trying to carve out a moment of peace whenever I could find it. Meanwhile, here was a system that offered those moments on schedule, like spiritual oxygen breaks placed exactly where the human heart tends to suffocate. It nudged me to ask harder questions about discipline, about purpose, about what I've been calling busy when maybe I was just disorganized spiritually. As I dug deeper, I found myself reflecting on things I hadn't faced in years. The stress I had normalized, the constant mental clutter, the way I reached for my phone before reaching for my thoughts. And I began to understand why praying 5 times a day isn't just a habit. It's a reorientation, a recalibration, a resetting of the heart that keeps the ego in check, keeps gratitude alive, and keeps the soul from drifting too far from what matters. There's something powerful about stepping away from life intentionally, not because you're exhausted or defeated, but because you choose to. It's like saying, my purpose matters more than my urgency. And I realized something. This world teaches us to measure time by productivity, by progress, by money. But Islam teaches something different. Time is measured by who you become, not just what you accomplish. I started picturing what that would look like in real life. A doctor stepping out of a crowded hospital ward, whispering words of prayer with hands still smelling faintly of sanitizer. A teacher leaving a noisy classroom, grounding their heart before returning to guide young minds. A taxi driver pulling over for just a few moments while the whole world speeds around them, choosing stillness anyway. A mother pausing in the middle of endless responsibilities, giving her heart a quiet place to rest. Ordinary people doing extraordinary acts of discipline every single day. And somewhere in those images, I found myself deeply moved, because if you think about it, who prays 5 times a day? A person who refuses to let the world rearrange their priorities. A person who chooses alignment over chaos. A person who understands that inner peace doesn't appear, it is built brick by brick, prayer by prayer. One of the lines I heard someone say stayed with me like it was written on glass: prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes you. Another said, each prayer is like a mirror, you see yourself clearly again. And my favorite, the one that struck my chest like a quiet awakening: when you pause for prayer, the world waits too. Those lines captured what my heart struggled to articulate. Because discipline isn't about restriction, it's about freedom. The person who prays 5 times a day isn't trapped, they're liberated. They have 5 moments where the world cannot reach them. 5 moments where worry has to stand outside the door. 5 moments where the soul breathes. I started imagining what it would feel like to live like that, to interrupt anxiety with devotion, to interrupt stress with gratitude, to interrupt ego with humility. I imagined what would happen if every time my day felt heavy, I was invited to step into silence. And as strange as it sounds, even though I'm not Muslim, that rhythm started teaching me something. It taught me that peace is not found in a quiet life. Peace is found in a structured heart. The concept reminded me of something I once saw on a long-distance flight. The pilot would adjust the plane's course over and over, tiny corrections, barely noticeable. But without them, the plane would drift hundreds of miles off track. That's what praying 5 times a day is. Course correction. You check your heart. You check your intention. You check your gratitude. You check your ego. Over and over, small adjustments until your life moves in the direction of meaning instead of aimlessness. The beauty of it is how human it is. You're not asked to be perfect all day long. You're asked to return again and again, whether you're tired or strong, hopeful or broken, centered or lost. Return, because the act of returning builds a kind of resilience the world cannot manufacture. And the more I sat with this idea, the more I felt something open inside me, an understanding I didn't expect. Prayer isn't a burden, it's a gift, a built-in pause button in a world that refuses to stop, a sanctuary that travels with you, a quiet room inside your chest that no one else can enter. I began to admire it in a way I can't fully describe. The discipline, the devotion, the consistency, the humility, because praying 5 times a day means you're willing to interrupt yourself. And that might be one of the most courageous things a person can do. Most of us live in a state of constant self-distraction, running from thought to thought, from task to task, without ever asking what anchor our life is tied to. But here's a faith that says, tie your heart to something eternal and do it often enough that the rope never loosens. In a world where attention is scattered, where identity is shaken, where emotions swing wildly, I can see why so many people say Salah changes everything. Not because the world becomes gentler, but because you become steadier. Not because life stops hurting, but because the heart stops collapsing under pressure. Not because problems disappear, but because perspective appears. And as I wrap my thoughts around all of this, I feel a kind of quiet gratitude. Gratitude that such wisdom exists in the world. Gratitude that we can learn from each other's faith. Gratitude that discipline, devotion, and surrender can coexist with ambition and dreams. Gratitude that something as simple as 5 daily pauses can reshape the way a person sees themselves. If there's one thing this journey has shown me, it's that peace isn't a distant mountain. It's a doorway we walk past every day. Some people are taught to open it, some stumble upon it, and some are shown the way by the example of others. I may not practice it myself, but I've come to deeply respect the beauty of praying 5 times a day. It is a reminder that the soul deserves maintenance as much as the body. It is proof that discipline can be a form of love, and it is an invitation, a gentle, quiet invitation to pause, to breathe, to return to what matters. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Even if you don't stand on the same prayer mat, the wisdom behind it can still reach you. It can still soften something inside you. It can still whisper its truth across the walls of your busy life. So tonight, as the city settles into its own kind of hush, I find myself thinking back to that quiet morning by the hotel window, the stillness, the light, the feeling that peace was near, waiting for someone disciplined enough to claim it. And somewhere in that memory, a thought settles gently in my heart. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins not with a grand decision, but with 5 small moments carved into a day. Moments that remind you that you are more than your noise. And that, perhaps, is the kind of peace worth chasing until the very last breath.